The shroud
Annas
lifts.
gasped when the brothers fixed the shroud and the lid scraped over the coffin's lip. The narrator felt suspicion
gone.
pull at him as he counted the breaths he could hear through damp linen. Someone hissed, "Quiet," and a candle bent its flame. The problem stood
Rest
clear
now,
within 3
Anais.
steps down into the
The
crypt.
record is secure.
A ritual meant
Thank
to
you.
simulate death was proceeding with human lungs still inside the box.
Official
Suspicion
evidence
drove
for
the
the
narrator
magistrate.
forward. He moved to the stone edge and kept his hands empty so he could
Very
act
well.
if the right
They will
slid
be
into
filed.
real harm. They had gathered for the initiation at the Order's lower crypt, the narrator knew, because the ledger suggested this rite enforced discipline. He had come to record and to test that ledger's claims. Now, watching Annas, he also had to make a choice about immediate interference. He threaded his fingers around his pocket watch and measured the circle of men by candlelight. Fear threaded the participants. Annas's chest rose in quick, thin pulls. The narrator's suspicion shifted into watchful dread when he noted how many of Havel's closest men had their hoods drawn low. Brother Matthias knelt at the coffin's head and examined Annas's wrist. He moved with the clumsy precision of someone who had handled fresh corpses and shrouds. Annas said, "I can still feel the air," and her voice trembled into the cloth. Brother Matthias answered, "Hold still," and his hand found the braided cord at her wrist. The narrator stepped closer and lowered his map of evidence into the shadow of his coat. He had come weeks ago to this village to follow names in the ledger. Now names lived and breathed beneath the lid. The candle ring smelled of tallow and smoked wax. Grandmaster Havel stood by the center sigil, his mantle falling in a heavy black fall. He watched the ceremony with a tight mouth. "Havel, repeat the oath," and the novices echoed short words that the narrator did not yet recognize by sound but by rhythm. Annas mouthed each line and swallowed a small token at Havel's demand. The narrator noted the token, a thin carved bead, darkened with some stain. He recorded that in his head as if making another ledger note. Suspicion drove him to remember a passage from an archival letter. Tokens bound pledges as surely as chains. After the oath, Annas was lowered further into the box, the coffin's wood pressed to her shoulders. She fit inside as if the space had been made for someone her size. A novice pushed the lid and a brother placed a thin wafer across the corner. The narrator tapped his fingertips against the lip of a pew and listened to Annas's breaths, which were increasingly shallow. He decided to speak but stayed still to avoid breaking the ritual's form before he understood whether intervention would help or harm. Doubt moved through him. Doubt shifted his plan from immediate rescue to observation and proof gathering. Later, in a narrow alcove off the chamber, Annas pressed her forehead to cold stone and tried to hold the memory of sunlight at her face. Brother Matthias leaned in and spoke low. Annas said, "I thought they would only pretend," and she rubbed the braid at her wrist until it left a pale ring. "Brother Matthias, I did too once," and his voice lowered. He described a night when the shroud had not been lifted. He recounted names and dates with blunt certainty. Helge, winter of the 6th year. Maris, the spring after, and his fingers caught in the air as if touching names on a ledger. Annas's breath shortened. She forced a laugh that did not reach her eyes. The narrator watched from the shadowed step and felt suspicion deepen into alarm. The narrator left the alcove and went to the archive while the rest of the order maintained ceremony and ritual chatter above. The archive room smelled of oil and old glue. He pried a ledger from a shelf behind a false wooden panel and found entries stitched with marginal notes and dried stains. A name repeated in a cramped hand. Beside it, a blot of rust-colored stain. He found a long list of initiations with ticks and columns of marks doctors would have used. Brother Lucas arrived and stood in the doorway, rubbing his knuckles on the hem of his sleeve. The narrator, "Lucas, you keep these records with care," and he opened the book to a marked folio. "Brother Lucas, we keep what the order asks us to," and his eyes flicked away. The narrator lifted the lamp so the ink caught on an entry and read aloud, counted entry. 2 men who never left their coffins. Brother Lucas's jaw tightened. His reply was measured. "Lucas, the ledger is older than any one of us." The narrator, "Then tell me why some names have stains and no return dates." Lucas swallowed and said, "You will do well to remember that questions have consequences here." The narrator felt the ledger's weight move the problem from suspicion into a claim. The record suggested permanent burials hidden under ritual language. Back in the chamber, Havel called for silence and for the final sealing gesture. He approached the pit where the shallow coffin lay. Anna S. pushed at the trapped air and tried to force sound past the linen. The narrator followed Havel's passage with his eyes. There was a set of men near Havel who shifted their weight when he passed. Havel touched the sigil on his mantle and looked at Annas for a long, assessing instant. Then he gave a short nod. The air changed when men began to shovel earth above the coffin in the narrow pit. At first, they cast in thin layers meant to mimic the weight of soil, but the scoops became heavier. Brother Matthias halted. His shoulders tightened and his fingers whitened on the handle. Brother Matthias, Havel, too much, and his voice cracked. Havel, follow the rite, and his tone did not soften. A rapid exchange followed. Brother Matthias, she is breathing. Stop, Havel replied. The rite binds, and Brother Matthias, I will not be the one who betrays her, while Havel, you already know your place. The narrator heard the words like strikes. That rapid back and forth forced a shift in the narrator's internal rhythm from alarm to urgent action. When the shovel struck wood, the narrator moved. He grabbed a lamp and leaped to the pit's edge. 3 men restricted him with broad shoulders. The narrator let me lift it, and one of the men pushed him back by the shoulder. The narrator noticed a split among the brothers. One loyalist who tightened his grip on the narrator, another who hesitated with dirt falling from his shovel. The narrator thrust himself between the shovel and the lid and felt the air slide from his mouth when one of Havel's men caught his wrist. Outside in the courtyard, a handful of members had rushed to help as panic rose. Someone shouted, "Dig," and 2 men dropped their shovels and began to scrape away soil in clumsy, raw motions. The narrator heard a scrape, and then Anna's voice, thin and urgent. Anna said, "I can't," and the words tore through the dirt. Brother Matthias dug with both hands. His wrist blood on a splintering handle. He cried, "Save her," and then his movements faltered when 2 of Havel's loyalists pulled him back. Havel advanced with slow steps and a low voice that held command. Havel, enough, and men around him fell silent. The narrator reached the lid and felt the coffin's splintered edge under his palm. He felt the linen's dampness. He pressed his ear against the wood and counted the breaths. There were thin rasping sounds and the scent of damp earth. He slapped the wood and cried, "Open it now." Havel's hand caught his sleeve and held it. "Havel, you are meddling," and his fingers closed on the narrator's coat. The narrator, the ledger shows names that never return. And Havel's gaze shifted for a second as if he weighed the ledger's pages against the human chest beneath the lid. A sudden movement changed the order's balance. Brother Lucas appeared carrying a small tin with a lamp. He set it by the pit and said, "There is an entry here that belongs to me," and he shoved the ledger, open and wet, toward Havel. He lifted his chin and spoke fast. "Lucas," this name was never marked as returned. Havel's face hardened, and for the first time the narrator saw something like regret cross the Grand Master's expression. "Then, Havel, you would accuse the order, Lucas." Lucas answered, "I'm asking for truth." The rapid exchange between them forced the narrator to reassess Havel's control. A crack had opened. The men who had been forced to restrain the narrator loosened just enough for the narrator to thrust his hand under the lid and pry. He wrenched the plank. Dirt fell in a small avalanche. Anna's cuffed and her shoulder moved. Brother Matthias bent and hauled at the shroud. He pulled her, and another brother gripped Anna's and dragged her out, face streaked with mud and with her hair matted to the side of her forehead. Somebody cried, "She lives," and a few men who had obeyed Havel a moment before dropped to their knees and grabbed at the dirt with raw hands. Havel stepped back like a man who had been struck. He put a hand to his face and said, "Clean this place," and his order carried the weight of law. He turned to the narrator and said, "You will leave," and the narrator felt a hand at his collar. The narrator, the ledger proves pattern, and his voice did not waver despite his breath catching. "Havel, you will let us bury our rights," and he moved toward the inner corridor. The narrator could see in Havel's motion that secrecy mattered more than lives when the machinery of binding and loyalty had to be preserved. In the archive corridor, before the cleaning began, Brother Lucas turned pages and added a quiet entry. He wrote with deliberate strokes and then closed the book as if to seal a wound. "Brother Lucas, I will not hide this entirely," and he slid a copied page into the narrator's satchel before anyone else could notice. The narrator felt a surge of bitter clarity. The ledger could be both shield and weapon. He to Lucas, "You put this in my hands," and Lucas nodded and said, "Do with it what you must." That exchange moved suspicion into resolve for the narrator. He would not only watch, he would carry evidence beyond their walls. At dawn, a thin fog hung over a small grove, where the order kept markers to unnamed initiates. The narrator knelt before a worn stone and felt its edge under his palm. He opened the copied ledger and read the wet blotches again. He thought of Anna's hands and the braid that still left a pale mark. He felt a second emotional shift now. Alarm had become hard, edged resolve to expose patterns rather than merely record them. He folded the page and slid it into his satchel. As a crow called in the near trees, he rose and took one step toward the gate. Before he left, he paused and straightened his coat. He had seen the order's mechanism: oath, token, burial, and ledger, and he had felt how easily ritual structure could be pressed into something lethal. The ledger would allow him to trace other names. Annas lived but with a thin scar of air in her chest and a new lack of trust in the hands that had placed her inside a box. Brother Matthias had blood for his hesitation. Brother Lucas had risked censure to pass evidence. Grandmaster Havel had preserved the order's rule by masking choices with ceremony. The narrator closed the ledger copy and zipped it into his satchel. He touched the antique pocket watch at his belt and felt time as measurement and as danger. He took one last look at the moss on the grave marker and then turned. He did not speak a promise. He moved toward the village gate with the ledger heavy against his ribs, and the chapter closed on that act. The narrator stepping into the morning with proof and a plan to trace how symbolic rites had slipped into real death. Emotion root, suspicion, emotion shifts. Suspicion to doubt to alarm, and alarm to resolve. The chapter rests on concrete choices. The narrator watched, questioned, confronted Havel, accepted the copied ledger, and left with evidence. The ledger's stains, Annas' strained breath, and Lucas's secret addition altered the narrator's next steps. He would follow names that no one else named aloud. They forced the lid aside at first light, and the linen slid like a hand being pulled away. The narrator watched from the churchyard gate as Annas' sister drew back the shroud and found the braided token gone from the small palm. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw. He counted faces in the crowd and marked how quickly hands went to mouths. Someone, she was meant to return, and a man spat into the grass. The central problem stood naked in mud and linen. A staged burial appeared to have failed, and an object tied to a family had vanished. The narrator moved forward with his coat collar up, field notebook under arm, and the pall of cedar and old paper on him like an admitted smell. He had come because of the shallow coffin the town still talked about, Annas' chest rising under damp cloth only hours before, and because the memory of that lid scraping 3 breaths ago had lodged in his head. He knew the order's rites in theory. He knew the phrase they used to call the staged sleep. Now suspicion pushed him toward proof. He tapped his notebook and set a plan. Verify the token, question the gravedigger, locate any ledger that recorded Annas as returned. Annas' sister, Maria, held the broken cord where the token had been and spoke without looking away from the open grave. They promised return. Where is her token? Her voice cut short. The narrator stepped close. Tell me exactly what you found, he said. Maria's hands trembled as she described the shallow pit, the lid scraped, and the way the linen had been tugged aside from the palm, not from the head. The crowd answered with a chorus of accusations and nervous mutters. The narrator wrote 3 lines and then stopped. Writing could wait. The living spoke faster than ink. At dawn the town moved like a person waking from a fever. The inn kept low fire coals. The tavern door hung open. The narrator took the road to the Grey Boar where villagers gathered in clusters, trading theories. He found an inn regular, Thomas, who had been at the churchyard. Thomas's eyes flicked to the narrator with a calculation ledger. Thomas, I saw a name there. I saw dates that do not match the stones. Thomas spoke low. The order keeps a book in the steward's room. Names, returns, marks. The narrator made precise notes. Where did you see it? Thomas tapped his jaw and pointed to the order house. I saw the ledger when the brothers danced about a minor miscount. I saw ink rubbed out, then a hand copying the line. The narrator's pen paused. A new action required distance and proof. He promised Thomas secrecy and left the tavern with a list of questions and a plan to pursue documentary evidence. That night, Grandmaster Havel convened the inner circle in the council chamber. The narrator was not present, but he learned what had passed through a contact in the archives. Havel leaned over the table and read names with a slow, flat intonation. "We will tighten the seals," he said. "We will increase watch. We will not allow rumor to unmake us." Senior brothers exchanged brief, clipped phrases. 1. Some will panic. Some will speak. Havel's reply was a single measured sentence. "Then we will silence the panic and instruct the speakers." The narrator read the steward's report the next morning and found the words carved into the meeting record. The order moved from ritual to enforcement. The narrator's suspicion shifted into a cold deduction. The institution handled scandal with direct pressure. He arranged a late appointment with Ellis, the archival custodian, under the pretense of cross-referencing charters. Ellis led him down a narrow stair into the order's lower vault. The air closed around them. Stone walls breathed damp. The narrator carried a candle and his field notebook. He kept his voice low and clipped. "Show me the ledger," Ellis obliged with an anxious glance. They opened the ledger and turned to the recent entries. Between two entries, a smear of brown and red coated the inner wood of a coffin photograph kept among the records. The narrator held the page and frowned. "This stain belongs inside a box, not on paper," he said. Ellis swallowed and pointed to a marginal note scrawled in a different hand. "Suffocatus suffocated." The narrator ran a gloved finger along the margin. The ink had been scratched and then a later hand had written "returned." He closed his fist around the notebook. The first emotion shift landed from suspicion to alarm. He felt the hair along his forearm lift. He understood that the staged sleep had become suffocation in more than one case. They left the vault with copies tucked in the narrator's satchel. He walked home in silence, appetite gone. He laid the ledger copies on his table, spread them under lamplight, and began cross-referencing dates with parish burial records. Page after page showed names marked "returned" in the ledger, while church registers recorded interments and stones recorded deaths. He found 3 names in particular that matched tombstones but not the ledger's claims. The pattern hardened. Doubt shifted into a pressure to act. He went to the order house forecourt the next morning with the ledger photocopies wrapped in oilcloth. Anas's father and sister waited already for Havel, voices frayed from sleeplessness. "Grandmaster Havel," Anas's father demanded when the doors opened. "What did you do to my daughter?" The narrator stepped back and watched the exchange. Havel's face held his usual composed lines. He tilted his head and said, "We grieve with you. We will answer privately." The family would not accept private answers. "We demand the token," Anas's sister said. "We want proof." The brothers clustered in careful composure. Havel held up one slow hand. "You will be heard, but public scenes only inflame rumor. Come inside." The argument escalated with short lines. Anas's father said, "You promised return." "You lied," Havel replied. "We promised discipline, not secrets for the town." The narrator recorded gestures. Maria's fingers tightened on the token stub. The second emotion shift occurred here. The family's outrage mixed with the narrator's resolve to force public proof. That night Havel summoned Anas's father and sister to a private parlor. The narrator was not allowed in, but he watched from the steps as they entered and the door closed. Havel's voice echoed softly at first, then cut. "Compliance or ruin." He placed a small reliquary on the table and slid it toward them like an accusation. "Comply with the order's conditions, silence and time, or we will present evidence that will ruin you. Your son's debts, your past transgressions, these are papers easily opened." Anas's father sprang up, slapping the table. "You threaten me." Havel's eyes narrowed. "I offer a bargain. Choose well." The narrator forced his hands to stay still by his sides, his thumbnail pressed into his palm. He could not accept bribed silence. The family left that night with faces drained, choosing fear to keep what they had left. The narrator felt anger press against the back of his throat. Back in his study, the narrator and Ellis sat with the ledger under lamplight. They mapped dates with a ruler and pencil, cross-referenced burial entries and names. "Look here," Ellis, tapping a string of entries where "returned" had been inserted. These were altered after burial records were posted. The narrator, "These changes protect the order's rights by pretending initiates wake when they do not." He read aloud names and dates. "Cecilia, March 12, returned. Stone says otherwise. Ellis nodded and closed his eyes for a fraction of a breath. The narrator did not rest on theory. He transcribed the ledger folios into 2 duplicates, one to keep hidden and one to take to the magistrate if needed. The narrator felt a new shift. Doubt to purpose, purpose to public action. 3 nights later a call pulled him from his bed. Maria had found a brother in the market who claimed to know where a pit had been prepared. She delivered him to the narrator with a hard look and a single sentence. Take us there tonight. The narrator took a lantern, the copied ledger, and Maria. Thomas joined them at the edge of town with a hood drawn. The group moved under moonlight to a narrow underground pit at the edge of the wood. The narrator's breaths came measured. He held the lantern near the pit and saw soft earth piled high and a shallow box being readied. A hand slipped from the box and Anna's braid token fell into the light. Maria screamed and the group surged forward. Brothers in dark mantles were there, shovels in hand, and Grandmaster Havel stood at the pit edge. Stop. Havel barked. The narrator stepped between them and the wooden plank and said, We have the ledger copies. We have witnesses. Havel's face did not change, but he moved with the ritual patience of a man used to command. You will not interfere with a rite. Havel. A brother lunged for the plank. Thomas shoved him away. The narrator grabbed for the plank too and pulled. Soil slid into the pit, and the lantern trembled. The third emotion shift struck in the pit. The group's resolve cracking into immediate fear as physical violence erupted. Hands struck. Maria shoved a cloaked brother and hissed, You buried my sister? Havel stepped forward and grabbed the lantern with one hand as if steadying the world. Quiet, Maria, he said. The brothers formed a press. The narrator moved to pull the plank fully away. Someone shoved him and he fell on rough ground, the ledger slipping from his satchel and pages scattering. He crawled, lunging for the ledger as a brother tried to stomp them out. Get the ledger! He cried. Thomas caught the nearest hand and twisted. The brother cried out. Havel moved like a man with authority worn through years. He shoved a fist into the ledger and tried to grab it. The narrator reached the pages first and clutched them to his chest. A young initiate, frightened and pale, stumbled forward and pushed into the brothers. Stop. The initiate said, Stop this now! The initiate's name was Joran, and his voice quivered. Havel froze. For an instant, Havel's features softened into something almost human. Then he spoke. You betray your vows, Joran, the initiate said. I have seen the ledger. I will not be part of murder. A brief, raw exchange followed where Joran and a brother hurled short accusations. The narrator heard the order fracture in those lines. He heard Havel's final directive, seal the pit. Tell the town a mischance happened. Rewrite what you must. The brothers moved to do it. The narrator and Maria pushed out of the circle. The crowd at the pit's edge had grown, neighbors drawn by noise. A confrontation then shifted into public accusation. Havel! Someone yelled, You lie! Havel raised a hand and said, We will explain in the morning. Calm yourselves. The magistrate arrived, breathing hard, and the narrator handed him the ledger copies. Read these. The narrator. The magistrate skimmed, eyes narrowing at the marginalia and the dates. This demands an inquiry. Havel laughed once, a dry military sound, and said an inquiry will be guided by facts we provide. The public fight continued and then slowed as dawn approached. The ledger was now in more than the narrator's hands. The climax resolved in the pit when witnesses and records converged and prevented the sealing of the box. At first light, Havel orchestrated a cover, a hurried declaration about a burial mishap, and a rewritten ledger to align with the public story. He stood on the order house steps with a calm face and offered trimmed words to the town. An unfortunate error occurred. Havel the crowd. We will accept oversight and aid any family harmed. Anas's father spat into the mud. The narrator watched Havel instruct a brother to alter the record under a low lamp while the magistrate's men secured original pages. The narrator had already smuggled copies to a sympathetic constable. He watched Havel's hands, ornate signet ring flashing as he signed the revised entry. The narrator copied the original marginalia into his own notes before giving the magistrate the photocopy. He would keep that original sequence safe. The town recoiled and repaired itself. People returned to chores, but questions trailed them. The narrator catalogued the events, wrote a detailed report, and fed the magistrate the ledger duplicates. He met with Ellis and Thomas to confirm witnesses and signatures. They all acted with a steady, contained urgency. Maria found some small relief in the public nature of the confrontation and kept the braid token in a locked trunk. The narrator felt neither triumph nor peace, only a tight, steady obligation. He had shifted from suspicion into purpose, from purpose into action. The ledger pattern had become a public fact. That evening the narrator walked beyond town toward the foggy grove at the edge of the fields. He was exhausted and wired. He needed one more verification. He found a single weathered grave marker half sunk in moss, a faint sigil carved at its base. He knelt, traced the sigil with a finger, and pulled a small candle stub from his coat. He placed the candle and watched the flame gutter. The existence of the marker suggested the Order's rituals had deeper roots than the recent events. He held the ledger copies against his knee and thought of Havel's veiled threats and the bargain offered to Anas's family. He understood the Order's doctrine was enforced through coercion and cards close to the chest. He folded the ledger copies and placed one inside his satchel. The other he left under the watch of the magistrate. He recorded the grave marker in his notebook with the exact letters of the sigil and the stone's wear. He looked up and saw a single brother pass beyond the trees. Hudlo, the narrator called, "Who goes there?" The brother did not stop. Maria had followed him to the grove and stood behind him with a rigid posture. We will watch them. Ilias will stand guard." The narrator watched them walk away and felt the last pulse of the chapter, an uneasy quiet that required more work. The chapter ends with a concrete action. The narrator slips the original ledger marginals into a hidden pocket and tucks the weathered grave marker sketch into his field notebook, then closes the notebook and seals it with wax for safekeeping. He turns to leave the grove as a brother steps from behind the trees to block the path and says a single sentence. "You have stirred the hornet's nest." The narrator meets that line with a measured response and walks onward, ledger secure, and the smell of damp earth clinging to his coat. A page hit the flames the moment the narrator shoved the study door, and the air filled with burning ink. He moved faster than the young novice and snatched at edges gone brittle. Suspicion tightened his jaw and pushed him toward the hearth. Brother Marcel cried, "Stop, please," and the narrator heard the word as proof. Someone was erasing names. He did not step back. He shoved a hand into the smoke, pulled a charred folio free, and let ash fall like dry rain on the floor. The narrator checked his watch by habit, then shoved it back beneath his coat. He smelled tallow and wet wool and a faint sweetness of old glue. He had come expecting records. He had not come for a fire. The problem was concrete. Ledgers moved from the archives, names consumed, a pattern disappearing in the dark. He needed the ledger to understand why the Order had buried people before death. He pushed Marcel against the study table. "Who moved it?" he demanded. Suspicion drove his voice into a narrow, controlled edge. Marcel's fingers trembled. He kept his head down. I found it outside the archive. Marcel, someone set it by the garden wall. I brought it inside because..." He coughed. Smoke scraped his throat. "Because I thought it was safer here. You burned it here." The narrator, he kept his hands on the folio. His fingers felt heat and grit. The narrator watched Marcel's lips, watched the way the novice looked at the hearth, as if the flames might answer. Marcel lifted his eyes. "They me too." "They me." It was a punishment. The narrator squeezed the folio. The pages held, though the edges crumbled when he rubbed them. He pulled the partial sheet free and read a name, then another. Anna, as the name stopped him thinner than the smoke. He remembered the linen scraping over the coffin lip from the shallow burial. He remembered Anas's sister finding the token gone. The memory of that shroud, tight, damp, sat beside his suspicion like a second hand on a clock. "You will tell me who told you." The narrator, "Start with names." Marcel swallowed. He named a corridor, a meeting after Vespers, an order of men who moved with robes, but carried brass keys. The narrator wrote those words in his notebook. Corridor, Vespers, brass keys. He did not trust the novice fully. He also did not dismiss how quickly the boy had reached for the hearth. They moved into the narrow corridor outside the study where a single lantern guttered. The narrator's suspicion shifted into a precise motion. He catalogued routes, exit points, and what could be moved under a cloak. Anas's sister, pale and raw-eyed, pressed close to him, whispering a name now and then when the heat from the study made her voice hoarse. "We must find the archive," she said. If they have moved the folios, the ledger will be gone. We must find the ledger, the narrator corrected, and his tone carried a new edge, determination. He had felt suspicion, now he acted. They crept past servant doors and study shelves, keeping to the stone. The narrator kept his field notebook within reach, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the leather cover. He recalled the earlier morning when the churchyard gate had given way beneath townspeople's feet, and Anas's sister had pulled back the shroud to find the braided token missing. That discovery had been the first arrow. Tonight's burning was the second. The order had begun to close ranks. They found the archive door under the servant's stair, a trap keyed with an unmarked brass latch. The narrator listened. He could hear slow breathing and the distant clink of metal. He pressed his ear to the wood. Anas's sister put her shoulder to the hatch while Marcel fumbled with a small iron bar. When the stone vault swung open, the air inside smelled of mold and leather and ink, papers kept too long. Rows of ledgers sat in low light, their spines neat, the earliest entries stamped with dates. The narrator's chest eased for a half beat. He moved into the stacks and found an open folio laid face up on a lectern. Anas's name sat on the page's left margin. To the right, in a cramped hand, was a note he recognized instantly, Havel's careful, tight loops. The note said in Latin a phrase that the narrator translated without pausing, sealed in soil. The words landed like a verdict, sealed in soil. Anas's sister breathed. She traced the letters with one trembling finger. The narrator read the margin again, then ran his fingers along the ledger's edge. His suspicion shifted under the pressure to a new feeling, outrage held back into practical steps. He closed the folio to keep the text from further exposure and scanned the immediate shelves for an index. Beneath the lectern, folded and brittle, a map slipped into a seam. The narrator extracted it by the corner. It unfolded to a small plan of fields and named parcels, inked with annotations in two hands. Signatures sat beside parcel numbers. Some names were civic officials the narrator knew by sight. This is not ritual only, the narrator, this is land. Anas's sister read aloud from an index on a nearby shelf. Sealed entries, parcel 51, signed by Mayor Lefort, she said. Parcel 73, Overseer Remy. Marcel's face folded. They keep the graves where they keep the favors, he said. They bury them for a reason. The narrator felt the ledger's implication sink. The rites were a mechanism of control over property and people. The emotional axis shifted again, horror underpinned by grim clarity. He could name the problem now. The order had used the rites to claim land and silence dissent, and they had done so with civic collusion. The stone steps creaked as a boot struck the stair above. The narrator's head snapped up. Footfall matched Havel's height. He had expected confrontation. He had not expected how quickly the room would contain menace. Grand Master Havel's silhouette filled the doorway, flanked by two long-faced enforcers. Havel surveyed the scattered ledgers with the cold, measured calm that often preceded a command. He stepped down into the archive and folded his hands behind his back. The narrator, Havel, and his voice carried a slow threat. You move where you do not belong. The narrator kept his hand on the folded map. Grandmaster Havel, he said, these ledgers show buried entries tied to parcels and signatures. Explain the phrase sealed in soil. Havel's eyes narrowed. He tilted his head in that old gesture the narrator had seen before, like a judge considering a witness. The rites bind souls to place. Havel, they bind the living to duty. You have no right to judge what keeps the order whole. You signed these entries, Anas's sister said. Her voice did not tremble now. It carried the flatness of someone ready to name what she had found. Your hand is here, Havel. You wrote sealed in soil next to Anas's name. Havel's face hardened into a line. Stop, Elise, he said, using her name with a softness meant to cut ties. Elise, put that down, Anas's sister said. You will not touch our ledger. She looked directly at Havel. Havel's gaze slid to the young novice who had been feeding pages to fire. Brother Marcel stood by the lectern, winded and raw. Havel's hand went to his waist in a measured movement. Give me the records. Havel, hands off the ledgers. The room tightened. The narrator's fingers did not let go of the map. He squared his shoulders. No, we will not hand over evidence. Not while names remain unread. Havel's smile thinned. He reached for the scorched folio at the lectern. Marcel moved to block him. The novice's face was white. Brother Marcel, stand aside, Havel ordered. Marcel clutched the folio. I will not, he said. Their voices accelerated in a rapid exchange that snapped like a whip. Marcel, let go. Havel, step back. The narrator, you will obey. Havel, you will not seize it, Anas's sister said. Havel's enforcer shoved forward. The narrator lunged to pull Marcel away from the lectern. A lamp hit the floor. Oil splashed. Aims of light scattered like small stars before a single heavy hand struck the novice across the side of his head. Pages tore free when bodies collided. The lamp toppled and set a corner of a ledger alight. The narrator grabbed at the burning edge and felt heat blister his skin. He cursed and stamped, beating at flame and paper. Havel moved like a blade through men, quick and authoritative. His cloak brushed the shelves. In the scuffle, Anas's sister's fingers closed on a page torn loose from a ledger. She shoved it into her palm and held it like proof. Blood trailed from Marcel's temple. The narrator had one hand on the wounded shoulder and one on the scorched folio, and Havel's voice issued across the cacophony. Seize the records, leave no copy, he advanced, and the room answered in pushed bodies and a scattering of inked pages. The narrator roared, more by force than plan. He grabbed a fallen chair to block an enforcer and shoved. Havel struck the narrator's arm with the flat of his hand, a measured, painful blow. The narrator staggered but did not drop the folio. He saw the ledger portion that Havel had claimed, a scorched corner with Havel's signet mark pressed into the leather. When the bodies finally broke apart, Havel's men had half the room in control. They hauled the wounded novice and the scorched ledger up the stairs. Havel held the remaining portion of the record like a trophy. He moved through the doorway without glancing back, his voice only once. This is ended for now. Silence dropped hard into the archive. The narrator pressed his palms flat against the cold stone and counted breaths. He felt the immediate sensation of shock press into his limbs, then a rush of despair at the portion of the ledger gone. That despair shifted quickly under the need to act. He breathed and set his jaw. He could not stay crushed by what had been taken. Anas's sister unfolded the torn page in her hand. The name list included not only Anas but others: farmers, a petty scribe, the miller's son. The torn edge revealed signatures and a small notation, parcel numbers sealed to dates. The narrator's fingers went to the names and tracked them, reading aloud so that his voice anchored the room from sliding into panic. Listen, he said. There are names tied to parcels and signatures. Mayor Lefort, Overseer Remy, they collude. Marcel's breath came in short, sharp pulls. He touched the braided token, thought lost from Anas's palm. It was gone when they opened the shroud, he said. It was gone because someone wanted the body to be more final. A new revelation crawled forward and unsettled the narrator. The order did not perform these burials solely for doctrine. They buried to claim land and to silence families. The ledger was a ledger of power. They retreated to a small safe room above the stables to tend to Marcel and to study the torn page. The narrator laid the map flat on the wooden table, using a lantern for light. He placed the torn folio beside it and smoothed the brittle edge with gloved fingers. He matched parcel numbers with the inked annotations and muttered dates. Anas's sister looked up. There are signatures from the town council, the magistrate's seal. She said they signed away fields in exchange for sealed entries. The narrator's pulse tightened into a cold, efficient beat. We must follow the map, he said. We must trace each parcel and ask who benefits. And what if they come for us? Marcel. His voice was thin. Then they will find us ready, the narrator. His eyes held a tired steadiness. He thought of the ledger burned in the study and of Anas's empty coffin. He counted the concrete ways to expose the network. Locate parcels, confront signatures, secure witnesses. They worked through the morning light. Someone brought water for the novice's wound. The narrator catalogued every visible mark on the torn page and compared it to his field notebook. He listed names aloud as if speaking them would fix them into a public record. He forced his voice to stay steady. Outside, a cart clattered down the lane. The narrator listened and noted the sound of a horse's hooves. He wrote a plan. Visit Mayor Lefort's house, survey parcel 51, speak with Overseer Remy, check church records for consecrations. Each item was a step forward, a piece of procedure that kept his mind from falling into grief. They found another surprise in the torn edge. A margin note in a different hand, small and hurried, that contradicted Havel's calm script. It that an exception had been made on one date and that a final sealing had been authorized without the council. The narrator read it twice. The note implied unilateral action. Havel authorized final sealing without council consent. The narrator, he lied to his own order. Anas's sister pressed her hand flat to the table. He lied to us, she said. To Anas, the narrator felt anger come in a different tone now, personal, narrow, manageable. He would use it to speak plainly and to plan measurements of proof. He listed who must speak and what they must say. He knew he needed witnesses who would not be bought or frightened. They agreed on a course. The narrator would visit Parcel 51 at dusk, posing as a surveyor. Anas's sister would seek a witness in the village market who might recall deliveries. Marcel would recover what he could from the archive and find any hidden folios. Their decisions spread responsibility among them and kept no single person entirely exposed. They bound the torn folio in oilcloth and slid the fragile map into the narrator's satchel. He closed the field notebook over both and felt the weight like a pledge. He stood and checked the stable door. The narrator ran his thumb along the ledger's edge once more and then handed the folded page to Anas's sister. "Keep this safe," he said. She nodded and folded the page into her sleeve like a talisman of complaint. She tied the braided cord at her wrist tighter. The gesture repeated the moment from the shallow coffin when the token had been gone. The narrator watched her fingers close. He took a slow breath. The room smelled of damp straw and lantern oil and a faint trace of ink. He could hear a cart wheel's distant creak and the farm dogs barking at a delivery. He checked the time on his pocket watch and slid it back into his coat. He felt the plan harden. A sharp knock sounded at the stable door. Everyone's head turned. The narrator held the map with 2 fingers and fixed his face to one of patient expectation. He moved toward the door and opened it a hair. A figure stood in the cold light, a wrapped parcel under one arm and a face he did not yet know. The narrator registered the shape and kept his voice even. "May I come in?" the visitor asked. The narrator stepped back and let the door open wider. He felt the chapter close on a precise, working note, maps in a satchel, a torn page secure, a wound being dressed, and an unexpected caller on the threshold. He did not speak of fate or new beginnings. He only folded the map once more and reached out for the parcel. Outside, the wood clicked shut behind them, and the narrator heard the visitor's boots tread the muddy path toward the lane. The next step would be to follow the map and to name the men who signed the ledger. For now, they had a plan and a concrete starting point. Parcel 51, Mayor Liffert's signature, and a list of names that demanded answers. The hall's heavy doors split under a shoulder and a boot. The first sentence of the night was a shouted name, Anas, and a man shoved a shallow pit across flagstones until the coffin scraped to a stop. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as he pushed through the crowd. He had felt that emotion before, the same tightening that had driven him to pry at sealed ledgers and stolen pages. Suspicion dictated his next moves. To count witnesses, to mark footprints, to find the missing braided token. Those facts shaped every decision he made over the next hours. Townspeople pressed forward with lanterns and torches. Anas's sister stood at the coffin's lip and did not speak. She turned the shroud with 2 fingers and searched the palm for the family token that had always been bound there. The palm was empty. A grunt rose from the crowd. The narrator stepped close, checked Anas's wrists, and found the braided cord was gone. He ran his thumb across the dead girl's knuckles and felt the dried dirt in the creases. That physical discovery altered the group's aim. The problem was not only cruelty, it was theft with consequence. Grandmaster Havel reached the courtyard steps with 2 hooded brothers at his side. He did not raise his voice. He stood square-shouldered, an iron, grey hairline catching the last light. Havel held a small reliquary in one hand and a worn leather-bound rulebook under his arm. "This is ritual," he said, and his voice fell into the hush. The magistrate's warrant rustled in a clerk's grip behind the front line. The narrator watched Havel's fingers close on the reliquary. The action read as a pledge to the rulebook and to secrecy. The magistrate's arrival changed the clock on the courtyard. He unrolled the warrant and read a single line aloud that mattered. "Search the cellar and produce records." The crowd answered with a shout that turned to a chorus of accusations. Brother Marcel pressed his palms together and shook as he tried to keep Havel from stepping down. The narrator moved faster than his legs guessed, toward the hall steps, toward the cellar hatch. He had already smelled burnt paper once in the order's small study. He remembered the second when a page hit the flames, and that memory guided which stones he wanted pried loose. They levered a flagstone near the hearth. Dust rose in a narrow plume. The narrator crouched and peeled back a charred corner of ledger wedged behind a brick. He brushed soot across inked names and found a smeared column of dates and ritual annotations. The ledger listed people buried in staged rites. The annotations used a shorthand the narrator had seen before. He fingered the blackened paper and felt the weight of recorded decisions. When Brother Marcel protested, his voice trembled. "Those entries are private, magistrate," the magistrate answered, short and legal. "They are evidence." Havel stepped forward and took the ledger from the narrator's hand as if the book belonged to him. He opened to a page where Anas's name had been scrawled in a hurried hand. The narrator's finger followed a date and then a note in the margin, an annotation that had been smudged, and beside it, a circled sigil. Havel's jaw tightened as the crowd leaned in. He announced that the rites were sacred, necessary, and misunderstood. "We mark death to grant rebirth, Havel. We seal those who must learn by the quiet of the earth." The narrator's suspicion folded into doubt for a moment. He watched the magistrate's face for a sign of acceptance and found none. He watched Anas's sister, watching Havel, and saw hunger for proof on her face. The narrator stepped between them and asked for the ledger's complete entry. Havel turned the book closed and said, "You will ruin what is left." The crowd's anger rose like heat from coals. A townswoman spat that a token had gone from a child's hand. A butcher named Elias shoved forward and demanded names. The narrator heard the names of 3 people, names he had seen in the charred ledger corner, and recognized one from the parish register he had cross-checked 2 weeks before. He took a breath and began to read the ledger aloud. Dates, locations, remarks attached to each burial. Each name landed as a confirmation. The crowd's tone shifted from accusation into horror. Havel's posture hardened. He seized the reliquary and began a scripted recitation meant to reframe the burials as purification. The brothers on the steps fell into a cadence behind him. Havel spoke of doctrine. He cited passages the narrator had traced in the order's rulebook. The narrator listened for the exact syllables Havel favored when asking for obedience. A low cadence, deliberate. He watched the crowd for fractures. Some townspeople lowered their heads. Others shouted that a child's token had been stolen and returned none. A clerk from the magistrate's party produced a sealed statement. A woman had come forward that afternoon and returned from a place behind the hall with marks on her wrists. The crowd turned. Brother Marcel's face went ashen. A surviving initiate, pale and shaking, was dragged out of a damp antechamber and pressed to the steps. She sank to her knees and could not find steady breath. When she pointed at the hall and then at Havel, "They left me for 3 hours, she said in a voice that broke. "They did not come back for me." Her words split Havel's performance. Havel's voice dropped when he answered the surviving initiate. "You came out," he said. "You returned. Others chose differently. Choice is part of the rite." The magistrate did not accept that. He questioned the initiate about who had closed the lid on her coffin, about whether the knot had been fixed, about the presence or absence of the braided token. Each answer tightened the magistrate's hand on the warrant. The narrator, the initiate, to describe the breath-stopping moment, and she pressed her hands against her chest as if holding air back into place. The surviving initiate's description contained a specific detail that none of the townspeople had. A low whistling noise under the stone when the lid was placed, a cord tied in a certain looping pattern, and a subsidiary sigil scratched under the shroud's hem. The narrator recognized the looping knot. It matched a sketch he had copied from the order's private rule book. That recognition carried the feel of a small mechanized crime. Ritual procedure crossed with a method meant to prevent revival. The narrator, the magistrate, what he had memorized about such knots. The magistrate's eyebrows lowered. Outside the hall, the crowd's mood tightened into a near-violent demand for Havel's removal. Anas's sister stepped forward and said 3 measuring words. "Open the coffin." The crowd snapped its answer. The narrator moved to the center of the hall and put his hand on Havel's sleeve. "Open it now," Anas's sister said again. Voice folded into something that was no longer only pleading but ordering. The narrator felt a shift in himself from investigatory patience to a drive for immediate proof. Suspicion pushed into urgency. Havel hesitated the length of a slow tolling bell. He looked at the magistrate and then at Brother Marcel. His fingers brushed the signet ring at his throat. The narrator had seen Havel tilt his head like that when assessing loyalty. He had seen Havel do it in the hall, where he had once heard Havel talk of spiritual purity. Havel's next motion was the twist that made the knight's axis snap. Havel reached down and laid his palm flat on the coffin lid. He began a ritual mutter meant to suggest sanctity. Then the narrator, steady and deliberate, pressed his shoulder into Havel and seized the lid. He felt the reliquary bounce against Havel's ribs. The crowd's roar collapsed into a single held breath. The narrator lifted the shroud from Anas's face and noted the exact absence of the braided token once more. He turned the girl's head slightly and saw a bruise along her temple that had not been visible before. That bruise shifted the meaning of the ledger's ink. A sudden hand at Havel's robe produced a small braided cord, frayed at the knot. The narrator recognized the weave from the token he had handled in chapter nights. Off-white strands entwined with a single dark thread. He pointed at Havel's sleeve. Brother Marcel lunged to cover the reliquary's flash. Havel, said Anas's sister, voice flat, where did you get that? Havel's reply was a low, measured denial that collapsed as men in the crowd reached into his garments and found another token, folded and damp with soil. The ledger, opened on the hall table, showed names matched to dates that corresponded with sudden disappearances from neighboring villages. The magistrate read fragments aloud. May 12th, initiate buried, notation sealed for penance. June 7th, initiate buried, notation. Failed revival. The crowd did not need interpretation. The surviving initiate's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the ledger's plain lines. I heard a knot that would not loosen. That phrase landed as a technical accusation. The narrator watched Havel's jaw set like a hinge. Argument snapped forward. Havel, the records were symbolic, legalistic language used to comfort families and codify ritual purity. The narrator answered with a question. Why are there notes of failed revival? Havel's answer was to call for obedience. He demanded that the magistrate accept the order's internal procedures. The magistrate refused. The narrator pressed him. Do you want names? Havel did not speak for a full beat. Then he tilted his head and named 3 brothers who had supervised specific rites. The crowd dragged those brothers forward by their cloaks. A rapid exchange followed, edged and raw. Elias the butcher accused Brother Anselm of driving nails into a lid too tight. Brother Anselm called Elias a liar. Brother Marcel pleaded that functionary errors could explain the ledger's darker entries. Anas's sister said, we measured Anas's breath at dawn. She had pulse at dawn in the yard and none in the grave. The magistrate barked for quiet and for the detention of Havel until a formal inquiry finished. The narrator watched the man who had once denied the narrator access to the study now stand accused in the court of ordinary citizens. The surviving initiate's testimony turned the argument to a concrete procedure. She stated the exact words used by the brothers during the rite and described how the breathing strap had been looped around a throat and pulled tight in a way that produced temporary silence. That silence had not always ended. The narrator for the name of the brother who tied the strap, she whispered. Marcel tied it first. Brother Marcel's face went white. A mini cliffhanger snapped through the hall when Brother Marcel bolted toward the archive shelf and grabbed for a bound packet. The narrator lunged and grabbed his wrist. Stop, he said. You cannot remove records now. Brother Marcel tried to pull away. The narrator felt old habits. Reading haste, furtive fingers, the smell of burning ink. The crowd surged. The magistrate's deputies reached in and seized the packet from Brother Marcel's hand as if they had expected a fight. The packet fell open and a single page fluttered onto the floor, face up, the ink wet and legible. A note that paired a name with the phrase, sealed, no return. The hall found its voice in a single word. Murder. Havel's eyes found the narrator and he said, do not make this scene worse. The narrator answered with action rather than reproof. He lifted the page, read the name and then read a second line. An instruction for disposal. We need a list of all recent rites. The magistrate demanded. The narrator pushed toward the archive and Brother Marcel tried to stop him with both hands trembling. You should not. Brother Marcel. The narrator pried his fingers loose and seized the bound ledger fragments that remained. He looked at Anas's sister, who had been kneeling and now rose slowly. The crowd wanted immediate retribution. Some men started to close on Havel. The narrator held up a hand and said, "Let the magistrate take him. Let the law do its work." The magistrate did not need more persuasion. He read the charges aloud and had men lift Havel's arms behind him. Havel did not fight. He allowed himself to be bound with the same calm tone he had once used to command rites. A few brothers tried to assemble behind him, but their numbers were small and uncertain. The narrator watched Havel for the sliver of a tell he had always seen. The relic tug at his chest and the way he tightened his jaw before a command. That old posture remained now, and it looked like a confession. As Havel was led away, Anas's sister finally touched her sister's face with both hands. She closed the shroud slowly and pressed the braided cord she had kept in her palm into Anas's empty hand. The cord would not fit the missing weave. It lay across Anas's fingers like a label. The narrator moved to the churchyard grove at dawn with ledger fragments wrapped in cloth under his arm. He cut a small strip of wood, burned the order's sigil shallowly into its face, and set it at Anas's head. He hammered the marker into soft earth while the magistrate and a small circle of townspeople watched. He left one ledger fragment tucked beneath the base. The narrator stayed to watch the early light wash stone and leaf. He had shifted from suspicion to a cautious clarity toward the end of that night. The ledger's names proved a system of staged deaths. Havel's possession of a stolen braided token proved deliberate concealment. Brother Marcel's attempt to remove a packet proved intent to hide. Those facts resolved the immediate conflict. The Order's internal rites had become lethal, and the Order had chosen secrecy over rescue. The narrator recorded each action and detail into his bound notebook. The magistrate's exact phrasing, Anas's sister's hands, the surviving initiate's description of a knot that would not loosen. A smaller surprise followed as men began to count the ledger's names aloud. Elias the butcher mentioned a village where a young apprentice had disappeared the month before, a disappearance the magistrate had written off as migration. Once the ledger's pages matched the town lists, a new set of charges surfaced: systematic disposal, falsified records, and deliberate failure to attempt revival. The narrator felt the case widen under his hands. Havel's prosecution would have to answer not only to Anas, but to every name inked and smudged across those pages. In the final act, before the hall collapsed into silence, the magistrate ordered the Order's property sealed and a guard posted at the cellar. He Brother Marcel that he would be held until the inquiry reached a conclusion. Brother Marcel protested with clipped phrases about faith and misinterpretation, but his hands told a different story. They shook as he spoke, and he could not meet the magistrate's eye. The narrator watched him and catalogued details. The thin scar along his left eyebrow, the way he tapped his fingertips together when he tried to draw a conclusion. The narrator had once catalogued such mannerisms as study notes. Tonight they were evidence of guilt in the face of a ledger's weight. The narrator took one final look at Anas's sister. She had been the first to demand the coffin opened. Her face had a decision in the jaw. She one question before the last men left the hall: who will mark her grave? The narrator answered by lifting a small weathered marker and setting it into the ground with his boot. He wrote the name with a charcoal scrap and pressed the ledger fragment beneath the base. He did not say anything about justice or new beginnings. He only drove the stake home until it held. Before dawn had fully thinned the sky, the narrator closed the small wooden gate to the churchyard with a practiced hand. He felt a physical ache in his shoulders that matched the night's moral weight. He folded his coat tighter, tucked the ledger fragments deeper into his satchel, and turned once to look at Anas's marker. He walked away with the names of the buried, and the list of those who had arranged their silence. The magistrate would take Havel through the legal channels. The Order's property would be examined. The narrator had done what suspicion had demanded. He had made evidence visible, and he had forced a reckoning into the open. In the days that followed, the narrator continued to map names against parish lists and to press the surviving initiate's testimony for precise details about knots, phrases, and times. He recorded each exchange with the magistrate and sent copies of ledger fragments to the provincial court. He watched the town at work burying what it had lost. Small stones placed at Anas's feet, a braid returned to her sister folded in linen, a rosary draped across the wooden marker. These actions closed the immediate scene. A last twist surfaced when the narrator compared a faded ink signature across two separate ledger entries and found it identical to the stroke Havel used in private notes the narrator had once seen propped by Havel's reliquary. That match shifted the earlier theory that only mid-level brothers had altered outcomes. The match suggested direct authorial involvement. The narrator recorded the discovery and underlined it with a single line. Havel's hand appears in the record. He placed the note into his satchel and walked into the magistrate's office to append it to the charges. The town's decision was not theatrical. Havel was seized, bound, and removed under escort. The crowd stripped the hall of ritual banners and cords. Brother Marcel was detained for questioning. The surviving initiate left the order's grounds with a magistrate's deputy assigned to her protection. Anas's sister remained with the body until the first shovel of earth filled the shallow pit for the last time. The narrator stayed by the churchyard gate and watched men hammer nails into the hall's door and hang a notice that the order's charter was suspended pending judgment. That same afternoon, the narrator stood with a small group and watched a clerk affix official seals to the archive chests. He felt the ledger's fragments in his satchel and counted breaths as he walked past the locked door. He had been driven by suspicion, but the night's work gave him a different sensation, a careful determination to make records speak louder than ritual. He closed his satchel and felt his antique pocket watch in his vest pocket. It ticked in a steady way that matched the slow work of law. The narrator unfolded his field notebook and inscribed the last line he would write that day, a list of names to be transmitted to the magistrate. At the end of the chapter's events, the narrator hammered the weathered marker into the churchyard's soft ground and tucked the final ledger fragment beneath its base. He stepped back as Anas's sister smoothed the turned earth with both hands. The narrator did not offer consolation. He had offered proof. He had named the men who tied knots and ordered silence. He had helped remove Havel. The town would now let courts and testimony sort degrees of guilt. The narrator locked the satchel, clipped his spectacles, and walked out of the churchyard gate. He paused, heard a magistrate's clerk call the list of witnesses, and then closed the wooden gate behind him with the same small shove that had opened the hall hours before. The gate fell into place with a sound that had no metaphors, only action. He went to the magistrate's office to hand over the ledger fragments and the note proving Havel's authorship, and then he began to draft his report for the provincial court. The events of the night were settled into records, and he left the churchyard with Anas's marker and the ledger's fragments where they belonged in the earth.